30 seconds after I said, "Welcome to my house," I watched my brother's phone slip from his fingers and crack against marble like a tiny gunshot. My mother's smile froze in place. My father turned the color of ash, and for the first time in my life, the silence in that room belonged to me. 6 months had been long enough to forget how heavy my parents' driveway felt under my tires. But the moment I turned into Buckhead, the old reflex returned, shoulders, tight jaw, set the careful breath before impact. Their brick colonial sat behind immaculate hedges, like it had been pressed and ironed the shutters, perfect, the landscaping too neat to be alive, as if even the grass knew better than to grow in the wrong direction. I parked behind my father's Mercedes and checked the rearview mirror like I was inspecting armor before battle. Makeup, flawless hair, pinned exactly right earrings chosen to say tasteful, but not desperate. The version of me that survived this house had rules: don't flinch, don't argue, don't hope. Inside the foyer smelled like furniture polish and my mother's expensive perfume, a scent I'd learned to associate with judgment delivered in a soft voice. I followed the clink of silver to the dining room, where my mother, Marianne Walker, was rearranging sterling serving spoons. With the concentration of someone preparing for a televised ceremony, she glanced up and offered me the kind of greeting that acknowledged a waiter, not a daughter. "Vivienne, you're here," she said already, turning back to the table. "Put the water glasses out. Your father's almost done with the brisket." No hug, no warmth, just instructions. Like Love was an employee she'd never promoted. The room was staged like a museum of other people's accomplishments. Family photos lined the walnut sideboard, but it wasn't family, mostly Conrad. Conrad at Harvard in his cap and gown, Conrad shaking hands with the mayor, Conrad holding some glass award that looked like it belonged in a bank lobby. There was one photo of me tucked into the corner like an afterthought, my high school graduation smile trapped behind glass, while the rest of the wall screamed his name. My father, Harrison Walker, emerged from the kitchen with a carving knife in hand, face flushed with pride, as if he'd built the house and the world with his own hands. He wore a Kiss the Cook apron, Conrad's gift from years ago, and announced to the room, not quite to me, "Sunday brisket's almost ready." I lied automatically. "Smells wonderful." It didn't. Harrison's brisket was famously dry, a tradition nobody dared mention, the kind of family flaw we pretended was charming, because admitting anything less than perfection felt like betrayal. Marianne circled the table again, fussing over napkins, and said with anticipation, "Conrad should be here any minute." He texted, "He's running a bit late, something about a call with Tokyo." Of course. Conrad was allowed to be late. Conrad's time was valuable. The rest of us existed on the edges of his schedule. The front door swung open as if summoned by his name, and his voice filled the house with practiced confidence. "Hello, family." Conrad walked in wearing a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my first month's rent when I'd started out, and even on a Sunday, he looked like he was heading into a board meeting. Marianne's face lit up like a switch flipped inside her. She rushed forward to hug him, her perfume blooming around him like a reward. Harrison clapped him on the shoulder and said, "There's my boy." Conrad loosened his tie, smiling that easy, polished smile. "Sorry I'm late. Had to wrap up some details on that Kensington acquisition." Harrison beamed the kind of pride that turned into blindness. "That's my boy, always closing deals." We settled around the table in the same positions we'd always occupied, like we were locked into a photograph. Harrison at the head, Marianne to his right, Conrad to his left, and me facing an empty wall that held no portraits, no proof I existed. Harrison attacked the brisket with the carving knife, carving the best cut for Conrad without hesitation, while Marianne passed dishes with the smooth precision of someone who'd hosted 1,000 dinners and never once relaxed. So Conrad Harrison said, setting the plate down like an offering, "How's life treating Atlanta's financial wunderkind?" Conrad laughed, accepted the plate, and said, "Can't complain. Just closed another round of funding. 8 figures. He chewed thoughtfully, then added, "Actually, I've been looking at some real estate." Marianne perked up instantly. Oh, where Conrad's fork hovered as he described it with the hunger of a man buying a symbol, not a home. West Paces. There's a modern place just listed $5.2 million. Floor-to-ceiling windows, floating staircase, the works. Perfect bachelor pad. Harrison whistled low. That's prime territory. Conrad nodded like it was inevitable. I've got a viewing Tuesday. Should be able to make an offer by the end of the week. My parents exchanged proud glances over the table, 2 people congratulating themselves for raising the kind of son who could spend that amount of money like it was a statement. Marianne's gaze landed on me like she'd remembered a plant needed watering. How about you, Vivian? How's that little online shop of yours? The words were casual, but the implication was sharp. Little online yours. I took a sip of water, the brisket drying in my throat, and said, "Actually, I've been house hunting too." The silence lasted 2 seconds before the laughter came quick and reflexive, like a door slamming shut. Conrad wiped his mouth with a napkin, grinning. "Good one, sis." Harrison's face shifted from amusement to concern, as if I'd confessed to believing in magic. "Your little online store is cute, Vivian, but it's a hobby. Time for a real job." Marianne murmured, "Harrison." But there wasn't any real protest in her voice, only the gentle correction of a woman who didn't want the scene to get messy. Conrad leaned back, smugness settling on him like a suit. "Stick to your trinkets, sis. Leave the big moves to the adults." I kept my face blank because I'd learned that reacting only fed them, and feeding them never filled me. Their laughter triggered a memory I hadn't invited in me at 20, standing in Harrison's study, clutching a 5-page business plan I'd worked on for weeks, the paper warm from my hands. I'd asked, "What do you think?" with hope ballooning in my chest, and Harrison had skimmed it for maybe 30 seconds before patting my head like I was a child showing him a crayon drawing. Cute, sweetheart. Meanwhile, Conrad just landed, Goldman Sachs. That was the night I made a vow so silent it felt like swallowing glass. I would never bring my dreams to that table again. After that came years of cold nights in garages at 2 a.m., packing boxes myself, taping seams, printing labels, and hauling shipments like stubborn proof of life. I lost $50,000, my entire savings, to a supplier who vanished overnight, and I rebuilt by working 3 jobs while maintaining the fiction that my business was just a cute side project. I didn't let them see the panic, the exhaustion, or the hunger, because the moment they smelled need, they turned it into a lesson about my shortcomings. Back at the dinner table, Marianne pushed a store-bought pecan pie toward me with an expression that suggested charity. "Have some dessert, dear. You're looking thin." I smiled the same practiced smile I'd worn for years, the one that never reached my eyes and never needed to, because they didn't look closely enough to notice. If they had, they might have seen the truth sitting behind my calm, that my so-called hobby had cleared $35 million last year, that my trinkets had been photographed in design magazines and staged in celebrity homes, that I employed 47 people who called me boss with respect instead of amusement. But I'd built my success like a secret room inside my chest, hidden, protected, and solitary. "I should get going," I said, standing. "Work tomorrow." Conrad snorted, playing store. "Meanwhile, we'll be talking real business." Marianne followed me to the door and pressed foil-wrapped leftovers into my hands. "Since you probably don't cook much," she said with a smile that felt like a small slap dressed as concern. In the car, my hands trembled on the steering wheel as I pulled away, the manicured streets blurring into night. The tremble wasn't just anger, it was something shifting. Something finally refusing to stay quiet. "Enough," I whispered to the empty car, and it didn't sound like a plea, it sounded like a decision. At the first red light, I reached for my phone and dialed Julian Thornton, the one person who never asked me to shrink so he could feel taller. He answered on the first ring, voice steady, familiar. How was family dinner? I didn't waste time with details. He already knew the shape of my pain. Conrad wants to buy a house on West Paces, I said. $5.2 million. There was a pause. Not surprise calculation. And Julian asked. I watched the road open ahead of me, dark and wide, like the world was finally making space. I want it, I said, and the words tasted like freedom. The house, and everything else they think I can't have. I heard Julian smile through the phone. It's about time, he said quietly, and the certainty in his voice steadied something deep inside me. Then let's show them what trinkets can build. By Monday morning, the version of me who'd survived Sunday dinner felt distant, like a role I'd finally been allowed to retire. I stood in the downtown Atlanta office of the perennial house as sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting clean lines across white furniture and vibrant accent pieces from our newest collection. This space didn't whisper hobby, it declared intention. Every candle, ceramic vase, and woven throw on the floating shelves told the same story: precision, patience, and refusal to quit. Julian Thornton stood near the glass hands in his pockets, surveying the city like a general reviewing terrain. He already knew how to win. He turned back to his desk, where quarterly reports lay open, their numbers blunt and unapologetic. Consistent growth profit margins that would make my brother choke on his own confidence projections, climbing into 8 figures. They still think you're playing store, Julian said, not as a complaint, but as a quiet marvel. I walked toward the windows, the skyline reflecting back at me like a version of myself I was just beginning to recognize. They don't know me, I replied. They know a story they told themselves so they wouldn't have to listen. The elevator doors slid open, and I stepped inside, still wearing the clothes from dinner the night before, as if I'd carried the weight of that house with me into the office. Julian glanced at me, already reading the tension in my shoulders. How bad was it, he asked. I didn't sit. Conrad's buying a place on West Paces, I said. $5.2 million. They laughed when I said I was house hunting. Julian exhaled slowly. Of course they did. A staffer approached us with fabric swatches, hesitating when she saw my expression, then straightening as if professionalism itself were a kind of respect. Sorry to interrupt, she said, but the Milan samples just arrived. I thought you'd want to see them immediately. My demeanor softened without effort. I took the swatches, ran my fingers across the textures, and nodded. These are perfect for spring. Schedule production for tomorrow. She smiled, relieved, and left. The exchange was brief, but it carried something my parents never had trust. 5 years, Julian said once we were alone again. 5 years building this, and they still think you're dabbling. I leaned against the glass, the city stretching out below like proof. Conrad mentioned investing in Modern Hearth, I added. Our biggest competitor. Julian winced. That's convenient. No, I said, turning to face him. It's deliberate. He's trying to crush my business without even knowing it's mine. Julian remembered the early days better than anyone. When we'd met, he'd been a jaded consultant with a 6-figure salary and no patience for dreams. I'd been a woman with a vision and nothing to lose. When I offered him the COO position, everyone told him he was insane to leave security for a startup run by a woman. My family barely acknowledged. He'd said yes without hesitation. You want the house? He said now, voice measured. I can afford it. I replied, not boasting, just stating fact. Easily. Julian nodded, then tilted his head. But what happens when they find out? When Conrad realizes his little sister outbid him, I walk to the vision board on the far wall, my fingers tracing projected growth charts and expansion plans that spanned continents. I've spent years protecting their feelings, I said. By hiding my success, I let them dismiss me. I'm done. Julian leaned against his desk, watching the shift happen in real time. You don't owe them anything, he reminded me. No, I said, meeting his gaze. But I owe myself this. Within hours, the strategy took shape. The house on West Paces wasn't just real estate. It was a symbol Conrad wanted as proof of dominance. We buy it through an LLC, Julian said, already typing. All cash, fast close, keep your name off public records. He pulled up the listing. The agent is Claudia Holbrook. We donated to her charity auction last year. I can get us a viewing tomorrow. I studied the renderings walls of glass floating staircase modern lines Conrad had described, like he was already living there. The one Conrad wants, I said. Buy it. Julian grinned, the thrill of clean execution lighting his eyes. Let's show them what trinkets can build. A week later, Claudia's heels echoed through the empty mansion as she led us from room to room, her voice bouncing off marble and glass. Julian murmured appreciatively about the staircase while I ran my fingers along cool countertops in a kitchen designed to impress armies. They accepted within hours, he whispered. Your brother never stood a chance. Morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating everything Conrad wanted but couldn't have. $5.2 million of modern architecture paid in cash. Any other offers, I asked. Julian smiled. One. Some finance guy who needed bank approvals. Conrad's face flickered through my mind the way he'd smirked at dinner. The thought warmed me more than I wanted to admit. The idea of the housewarming party came to me in the master bedroom's sunlight spilling across empty floors that would soon be mine. Julian leaned against the doorframe, mischief in his eyes. Invite everyone, he said. Let them admire the house before they know who owns it. I pictured my mother touching fixtures, my father commenting on craftsmanship, Conrad calculating square footage, all of them blind. That's deliciously evil, I said, smiling for the first time in days. I love it. The next 3 weeks blurred into design consultations and installations. I chose every detail from the exact shade of gray on the walls to the placement of pieces from my own collection. They should be conversation pieces, I told the designer. They already are, she replied. The invitations went out on heavy cream cardstock, minimalist, and anonymous New West Paces residents. Housewarming, no host name. When my mother called breathless with excitement, she said, Vivienne, did you get one too? Must be one of Conrad's new contacts. I agreed easily. Sounds interesting. She encouraged me to come to network with Conrad's crowd, unaware she was walking straight into a truth she'd spent years avoiding. On the night of the party, I stood in my new bedroom adjusting a black dress that felt less like armor and more like ownership. The house glowed outside lights, tracing modern lines like a promise kept. Inside, caterers arranged food music floated through the space, and Julian stood beside me at the bottom of the staircase, glass raised. To the woman who built an empire while they weren't looking, he said softly. When the doorbell rang and guests flooded in, I moved among them as a ghost, anonymous, watching admiration ripple through the rooms. An hour later, my family arrived. I saw them from across the room, my mother clutching her handbag, my father stiff with pride, Conrad scanning the space like a valuation spreadsheet. Whose house do you think this is? Marianne asked loudly. Conrad shrugged. Tech money. Old Atlanta wealth. My mother stopped at a vase from my collection and frowned. This looks like something from Vivian's website. Conrad scoffed. Knock off. I slipped away, then ascending the staircase until I stood above them all. Julian caught my eye and tapped his glass. The room fell silent as he said, Our host would like to say a few words. Every face tilted upward. I found my family instantly confusion, surprise, calculation. Welcome. I began, my voice steady. My family always worried my hobby couldn't pay the bills, so I'm glad they're here to see what that hobby bought. Welcome to my house. The silence shattered. Conrad's phone hit the floor. My parents stared like the ground had shifted beneath them. In that moment, the truth rose higher than the staircase beneath my feet, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to climb down. The stunned quiet that followed my words felt heavier than any applause could have been, a dense pause where every assumption my family carried finally collapsed under its own weight. I stayed where I was, one hand resting lightly on the railing, watching the truth ripple through the room as guests whispered and glasses clinked uncertainly. Marianne recovered first her social instincts, kicking in with the efficiency of muscle memory. Vivienne stopped joking. She said her laugh too sharp, too fast. "Whose house is this, really?" I descended a few steps, never quite giving up the higher ground. "Mine," I said calmly. "Every square inch." Harrison pushed through the crowd, his face flushed beneath silver hair, his voice dropping as he grabbed my elbow with a grip meant to control. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed. The smile he wore for the room stretched thin. "Is this some kind of joke?" I disengaged with a small twist, my voice steady. "No joke, no games, just facts." Behind him, Conrad stood frozen, his expression cycling through disbelief and calculation, the wheels behind his eyes spinning as his entire narrative about me unraveled. The party lurched forward again, servers weaving through awkward clusters, a chamber quartet filling the air with sound that softened nothing. $5.2 million, I said just loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Paid in cash. A woman from a design magazine approached me. Champagne extended admiration clear in her voice as she said, "Vivienne, this place is spectacular. We featured the perennial house last issue." Harrison's face drained of color. Marianne clutched her pearls like they might anchor her to reality. Guests drifted toward me, asking about the business offering congratulations, their attention forming a wall my family couldn't penetrate. The narrative they'd rehearsed for decades was dissolving in real time, replaced by one they hadn't written. Conrad found me near the wine table, his smile brittle bourbon glass clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened. "What game are you playing?" he demanded. "There's no way you can afford this." "What did you do? Get someone to front the money?" I met his gaze unblinking. "The perennial house cleared $35 million last year," I said. "I bought this house with my money." The satisfaction of watching his eyes widen was quiet but complete. He pivoted instinctively, grasping for relevance. "Why didn't you come to me for advice? I could have helped structure things better." I cut him off gently. "You never asked. Not once." The truth landed harder than any insult. He retreated, huddling with Harrison in a corner, whispering urgently while glancing in my direction. Marianne approached next emergency smile, firmly in place. "We always knew you were smart with money," she said, rewriting history without hesitation. Harrison joined her, asking about revenue models and scaling strategies, 8 years too late. "Perhaps we should have a family business dinner," Marianne suggested, honeyed respect dripping from her words. "There are opportunities." I offered nothing but a polite nod. Across the room, Julian caught my eye, raising an eyebrow in silent check-in. I nodded once. Everything was proceeding exactly as it needed to. As the night wore on, fragments of conversation drifted to me like secrets begging to be overheard. Near the bar, Harrison muttered about bridge financing, his voice tight. Conrad shook his head sharply. "The Kensington investment went sideways," he said. "Not here." Later, 2 analysts whispered about Conrad's firm missing targets, losing accounts. Julian confirmed it quietly, close to my ear. "Your brother's house of cards is wobbling." I filed the information away without reacting. Power, I was learning, didn't need to announce itself. 3 months later, sunlight poured through my West Paces living room, now warm and lived in, no longer staged for revenge or reveal. A cashmere throw lay across the sectional art chosen for meaning, rather than price, hung on the walls. Flowers from my own collection brightened the room. Julian sat opposite me, tablet in hand. "Third quarter exceeded projections by 17%, he said. "The sustainable line is outselling everything." I smiled, genuine this time. My phone buzzed with Marianne's name. I silenced it without looking. Julian watched but didn't comment. We moved on to expansion plans, partnerships, future collections, our shorthand easy and unburdened. When Marianne called again, weeks later, desperation clear in her voice, I agreed to meet but on my terms. Sunday at 5 p.m., the hour that once belonged to them. I watched through the windows as they approached my door. Harrison slumped Marianne, tearful Conrad trailing behind, eyes on the ground. I didn't greet them at the door. I stayed at the top of the staircase and said, "Come in." They sat where I directed the silence, thick and earned. Harrison spoke first. "We need your help." Marianne's tears spilled as she explained their savings were gone co-signed on Conrad's investment. I turned to Conrad. "What did you lose everything on?" he muttered, "modern hearth." I smiled, cool and precise. "We acquired their supply chain. You bet against me. You lost." I walked to the door and opened it wide. "Get off my property." The door closed behind them with finality, not anger. Now, months later, I stood by the window as evening settled my reflection, calm and unguarded. The house felt like home, not a statement. My phone buzzed again, unanswered. Freedom tasted better than revenge, I realized, not because I'd won, but because I no longer needed them to see me at all. The quiet that followed their departure didn't feel hollow the way I'd always feared it would. It felt clean, like a room after a storm when the air finally settles and nothing rattles anymore. In the weeks that followed, I expected guilt to creep in, expected to wake up at 3 a.m., questioning whether I'd gone too far, whether blood should have outweighed truth. Instead, what arrived was something unfamiliar and steady. Peace. The house on West Paces stopped being a symbol and started becoming a place. I learned which windows caught the best morning light and which corner of the living room stayed warmest in the afternoon. I stopped bracing myself every time my phone buzzed. Silence, I discovered, could be generous when it wasn't forced on you. By late autumn, the business demanded more of my attention than ever, not in the frantic way it once had, but with the deliberate pull of something growing strong and wide. I sat at my executive desk one afternoon, Atlanta's skyline glowing beyond the glass, as Julian slid a stack of acquisition reports toward me. "Supply chain acquisition complete," he said evenly. "That makes 7 of Modern Hearth's key suppliers now under our umbrella." I skimmed the numbers, calm and focused the way I'd learned to be after years of surviving without applause. Market analysts were already calling. The perennial house an unexpected powerhouse, praising our consistency, our ethics, our refusal to chase hollow trends. Modern Hearth, by contrast, was described as erratic, reactive, a cautionary tale wrapped in buzzwords. I signed the final paperwork authorizing the warehouse purchase without ceremony. "Once this goes through," Julian said, "you'll own their distribution center." I nodded once. "Let's finish it." The boardroom was quiet when the bankruptcy purchase agreement slid across the table. Lawyers watched me carefully, as if expecting hesitation, but there was none. I signed with the same hand that once packed boxes alone at 2 a.m., the same resolve that had rebuilt everything after I lost my savings. "Congratulations," counsel said. "You now own your largest competitor." There was no celebration, no champagne. Power didn't need a soundtrack. Back in my office, Julian handed me a magazine with Conrad's name buried in paragraphs that used words like mismanagement and investor confidence shattered. I read it without satisfaction or grief, just recognition. He had gambled on arrogance, and arrogance always charged interest. My phone lit up again that week, Marianne's name flashing with increasing urgency. I let the calls go to voicemail, listening later to the way her voice cracked, the way Harrison's certainty had vanished from the background. Julian watched me set the phone face down and said quietly, "You don't have to answer." I know I replied and meant it. When I finally agreed to meet them, it wasn't because I felt responsible, but because I wanted to close the last open door on my own terms. The meeting unfolded exactly as it needed to, without raised voices or dramatics, just truth delivered cleanly and a boundary that didn't bend. Months passed. The house softened around me. Friends filled it with laughter that didn't carry conditions. Dinners stretched long without competition, without scorekeeping. One afternoon, sunlight poured across the living room as Julian and I reviewed third-quarter numbers sprawled across the coffee table. "Exceeded projections again," he said, tapping the screen. "The sustainable line is outselling everything." I smiled, not the shield I'd worn at family dinners, but something unguarded. "People respond to honesty," I said. "Turns out that applies to more than design." My phone buzzed once more. Marianne. I didn't answer. I didn't need to explain. As dusk settled, I stood at the window and watched the city shift into evening lights, flickering on like quiet affirmations. My reflection in the glass looked different now. Shoulders relaxed, eyes clear, posture open. This house was no longer proof of anything. It was simply mine. I thought about the years I'd spent shrinking my voice so it wouldn't disrupt someone else's comfort, the way I'd confused endurance for virtue. Success hadn't freed me. Clarity had. Knowing when to walk away. Knowing that love without respect was just another transaction and I'd stopped accepting bad deals. Later, as I set my phone down on the counter without checking the missed calls, I realized something that surprised me with its simplicity. I hadn't taken anything from my family. I'd only stopped giving away myself. And in that space, something better had grown. A life that didn't ask permission. A future that didn't need witnesses. By the time winter settled over Atlanta, the house had learned my rhythms the way skin learns warmth. Morning light filtered through the glass in pale gold bands. Afternoons carried the quiet hum of work well done, and evenings arrived without the old knot of anticipation I used to mistake for belonging. I hosted dinners now that felt nothing like Sunday nights at my parents' table. Friends lingered. Conversations, wandered laughter wasn't measured or ranked. The walls held stories that didn't need defending. This wasn't victory, it was alignment. One afternoon, Julian and I sat at the long kitchen island reviewing plans for the next year, the marble cool beneath our forearms as he scrolled through projections with the same steady focus he'd brought since the beginning. "Chicago pop-up is confirmed," he said, "and the North Carolina manufacturer is ready to scale. Labor practices are clean materials sourced locally, margins still healthy." I nodded, appreciating the way the business had grown into something both principled and profitable, a reflection of the values I'd once been told were impractical. "Let's move forward," I said, slowly but decisively. My phone buzzed again on the counter, the screen lighting up with a name I no longer flinched at seeing, Marianne Walker. I didn't silence it immediately this time. I just looked at it, noticing how little it pulled at me now. Julian followed my gaze, then returned to the tablet without comment, a small gesture that carried years of respect. When the call ended on its own, the room didn't change. The plans didn't pause. The world didn't tilt. That was when it finally sank in, that freedom wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with a speech or a slam door. It settled quietly in moments like this, where nothing demanded I explain myself. I poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one across to Julian, who smiled faintly and said, "You know, a few years ago, they'd be lining up to tell you what to do with all this." I laughed softly. A few years ago, I would have listened. The truth of it didn't sting anymore. It felt instructive, like a lesson learned without bitterness. That evening, I walked through the house alone, touching the edges of things I'd chosen deliberately, a lamp from a small artist in New Mexico, a rug woven by a collective that paid its workers fairly, a photograph taken on a trip I'd once postponed because I thought success had to wait. Each piece carried a decision I'd made without asking permission. Outside the city glowed, not as a promise or a challenge, but as a companion. I realized then that I no longer measured my life against theirs. The scale had changed. It always had. I just hadn't trusted myself enough to use it. There was a time when I thought being seen was the goal, that if I could just stand in the right light, say the right words, earn the right approval, everything would click into place. But standing on that staircase, watching my family finally see me, taught me something I hadn't expected. Recognition doesn't heal what respect never touched. And respect, I learned, begins with how you treat your own worth when no one else is watching. I didn't rebuild my life to prove them wrong. I rebuilt it because giving up would have meant agreeing with them. Every late night, every loss, every quiet recovery was an act of choosing myself when it would have been easier to disappear. If there's anything I know now, it's this: you don't owe access to people who only celebrate you when you stop being inconvenient. Success doesn't require an audience, and peace doesn't need validation. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop explaining and start living. So if this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told to stay small, know that your work, your patience, and your resolve matter, even when no one is clapping yet. If you found value here, take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who might need the reminder and subscribe for more stories like this. And if you're comfortable, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from or what part of this journey felt familiar. Your story deserves to be heard too.